The gunshot cracked through the frigid Montana morning, echoing off the snow-capped mountains that loomed over Kennewick like silent guardians. Grace Nichols lowered her smoking Colt, a satisfied smile playing across her lips as the tin can flew from its perch on the fence post. It was 1879, and the frontier town was just beginning to stir as the first light of dawn painted the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. "Not bad for a schoolteacher," she murmured to herself, quickly tucking the weapon back into the specially sewn holster beneath her full skirts. Grace had arrived in Kennewick 6 months earlier, fleeing memories as dangerous as any outlaw. The small Montana settlement had welcomed her teaching credentials with open arms, desperate as they were for educated folks willing to brave the harsh frontier conditions. What they didn't know was that Grace had learned more than Latin and literature back in Boston. Her father, a former Union officer, had insisted his daughter know how to defend herself in a world that offered women few protections. "A lady should be accomplished in many arts," he'd say with a wink as he corrected her shooting stance. Grace gathered her skirts and made her way back toward town, her boots crunching through the thin layer of frost coating the ground. She needed to reach the schoolhouse early to prepare for the day's lessons. Her 20 students, ranging from 5 to 16 years old, were a rowdy bunch that required firm handling. Most were the children of miners, farmers, and shopkeepers, hard-working folk who valued education even if they hadn't much of it themselves. The main street of Kennewick was already coming to life as she walked past the general store where Mr. Finch was sweeping his porch, the blacksmith's where the forge was being lit, and the Rusty Nail Saloon where the night's more determined patrons were finally stumbling home. Grace nodded politely to those she passed, maintaining the proper demeanor expected of the town's schoolteacher. "Morning, Miss Nichols," called Mrs. Patterson from the doorway of her boarding house, where Grace had taken a room upon her arrival. "Early practice again." Grace's cheeks colored slightly. "Just enjoying the sunrise, Mrs. Patterson." The older woman's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Well, best be careful. Not everyone appreciates a woman with independent ways." Grace nodded, well aware of the delicate position she occupied. As a single woman in her 24th year, she was already considered dangerously close to spinsterhood. Her plain but neat dresses, her hair always properly pinned, and her unfailingly polite manner had thus far protected her reputation. But a schoolteacher caught practicing her marksmanship might raise eyebrows even in a frontier town like Kennewick. She was nearly at the schoolhouse when a commotion from the direction of the sheriff's office caught her attention. A cluster of men had gathered, their voices raised in excited discussion. "3 men dead," she heard someone say. "Marshal Wilkins says they've been operating out of the hills for months." "Ambushed the Billings stage coach yesterday," another added. "Poor driver didn't stand a chance." Grace slowed her pace, listening. Stagecoach robberies weren't uncommon, but they'd been rare around Kennewick until recently. "Rider gang," spat a third man, a miner judging by his dirt-encrusted clothes. "Word is they're moving this way, sheriff's forming a posse." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The Rider gang. She'd heard whispers of them back in Boston even before everything happened. Their leader, Jacob Ryder, had built a reputation for ruthlessness that stretched from Missouri to Montana. She hurried on to the schoolhouse, trying to push the unsettling news from her mind. The simple wooden building sat on the edge of town, a bell tower rising from its peaked roof. Inside, the single room contained rows of rough-hewn desks facing her larger desk and a blackboard. A pot-bellied stove in the corner provided the only heat. Grace had just finished writing the day's arithmetic problems on the board when the door opened behind her. Expecting one of her early arriving students, she turned with a welcoming smile that froze on her face. Sheriff Thomas Miller stood in the doorway, his weathered face grim beneath his gray mustache. Beside him stood a man she'd never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to hard living in the saddle. His face was tanned by the sun, partially shadowed by the brim of a dusty brown hat. A leather vest hung open over a faded blue shirt, and a holster at his hip held what appeared to be a well-used Colt revolver. "Miss Nichols," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "Sorry to disturb you so early. This here's Wyatt Reed. He's well, I suppose you'd call him a bounty hunter, among other things." The stranger tipped his hat slightly, revealing eyes the color of a summer storm. "Madam," his voice was deep and rough-edged, like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. Grace inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, maintaining her composure despite her racing heart. She'd learned to be wary of men who made their living with guns. "Mr. Reed's here tracking the Ryder gang," Sheriff Miller continued. "They've been moving through Montana, hitting stage coaches and small banks. I've asked him to speak to the town council tonight, but he needed a place to stay, and Mrs. Patterson's is full up with those mining engineers from Helena." Grace waited, sensing there was more to this visit than a simple introduction. "The thing is," the sheriff said, looking uncomfortable, "the only other place in town would be the rooms above the saloon, and that don't seem proper, what with children seeing a respectable lawman going in and out of such a place." "I'm not exactly what most folks would call respectable," Reed interrupted, a hint of dry amusement in his tone. The sheriff waved this away. "You're doing official business for the territory now. Anyway, Miss Nichols, I was wondering if you might have a spare room at your place. Just for a few days while Mr. Reed helps us deal with this situation." Grace stared at them, momentarily speechless. She didn't, in fact, have a place of her own. She rented a room at Mrs. Patterson's like most of the single women in town. The sheriff knew this, which meant, "Sheriff Miller, are you suggesting that Mr. Reed stay at the schoolhouse?" she asked, her voice level despite her incredulity. The sheriff nodded eagerly. "There's that small storage room in the back. Cot would fit fine. It's just temporary, you understand, and it would keep him close to my office, but out of sight of impressionable young ones." Grace looked from the sheriff to the bounty hunter, whose expression remained impassive save for a slight quirk at the corner of his mouth. The suggestion was highly irregular, but she understood the sheriff's dilemma. Kennewick was a small town with limited accommodations, and the Ryder gang represented a real threat. "I suppose it could work," she said finally, "provided Mr. Reed understands that school hours are sacred and his. Activities must not disturb my students' education." Reed nodded. "Yes, madam, I won't be any trouble." The sheriff looked relieved. "Much obliged, Miss Nichols. Mr. Reed can move his things in after school today." He turned to leave but paused at the door. "Oh, and Miss Nichols, might be wise to keep that Colt of yours handy just in case. Ryder's not known for his mercy." Grace felt her face flush. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Sheriff." Sheriff Miller chuckled. "Come now, Miss Nichols. Half the town knows you practice your shooting at dawn. Most folks find it reassuring, having a schoolteacher who can handle herself." After the sheriff left, Reed lingered, studying her with those storm cloud eyes. "Something amusing, Mr. Reed?" she asked, bristling under his scrutiny. "Not at all," he replied. "Just thinking it's a rare schoolteacher who carries a gun under her skirts." Grace lifted her chin. A woman alone in the West would be foolish not to take precautions. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to dangerously appealing. "I'd expect nothing less," he said, tipping his hat again before following the sheriff out. Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Wyatt Reed was exactly the kind of man she'd been avoiding since arriving in Kennewick. Dangerous, unpredictable, and far too observant for comfort. And now he would be sleeping just a few yards from her desk. The children began arriving shortly afterward, filling the schoolhouse with chatter and laughter. Grace pushed thoughts of Reed and the Ryder gang aside, focusing on her students. 10-year-old Tommy Parker was struggling with his multiplication tables, while the oldest girl, 16-year-old Emma Conroy, needed guidance on her composition about the Declaration of Independence. By midday, Grace had almost forgotten about her morning visitors until the door opened during the lunch break and Reed appeared, carrying a battered saddle bag and bedroll. "Sheriff said I should get settled while the children are outside," he explained, nodding toward the small storeroom at the back of the schoolhouse. "Very well," Grace replied, watching as he crossed to the door beside her desk. "Mr. Reed," she called as he reached for the handle, "I meant what I said about not disturbing my students. Whatever business brings you to Kennewick, I won't have it endangering the children." Reed paused, turning to face her fully. "Neither would I, Miss Nichols. You have my word on that." Something in his steady gaze made her believe him. Grace nodded and returned to grading compositions while he disappeared into the storeroom. The afternoon lessons proceeded without incident, though Grace was acutely aware of Reed's presence in the back room. When the final bell rang and the students had departed, she hesitated, uncertain of the proper protocol for addressing her unusual boarder. The decision was made for her when Reed emerged, hat in hand. "I'll be at the sheriff's office until late," he said. "Don't want to make you uncomfortable in your own schoolhouse." "It's not my schoolhouse, Mr. Reed. It belongs to the town. All the same," he settled his hat back on his head, "I appreciate the accommodations. Not many would be willing to house a stranger with my reputation." Grace was curious despite herself. "And what reputation is that exactly?" A shadow passed over his face. "Let's just say I've done what needed doing, and not all of it sits easy in polite company." Before she could respond, he added, "Lock the door behind me, Miss Nichols. And keep that colt close." The next morning, Grace rose even earlier than usual, making her way to her practice spot while the stars still shimmered in the dark sky. She'd slept poorly, her dreams haunted by faceless bandits and the disconcertingly vivid image of Wyatt Reed's storm-gray eyes. The shooting helped clear her mind, as it always did. 6 cans, 6 shots, 6 satisfying clinks of lead-meeting tin. Grace was reloading when a voice from behind nearly caused her to drop the weapon. "Your stance is too rigid, makes your follow-through slower than it needs to be." She whirled around to find Reed leaning against a tree, arms folded across his chest. In the dim pre-dawn light, he looked more like a spirit of the wilderness than a man something ancient and knowing and not entirely tame. "How long have you been watching?" she demanded, embarrassment quickly giving way to anger at being spied upon. "Long enough to see you're good," he replied, straightening, "but you could be better." "I didn't ask for your assessment, Mr. Reed." He approached slowly, hands raised slightly as if to show he meant no harm. "No, you didn't, but given what's coming this way, you might need every advantage." Grace tensed. "You have news of the Ryder gang?" Reed nodded grimly. "Scouts spotted them camped about 20 miles east. They'll reach Kennewick in 2 days, maybe 3. The sheriff is forming a posse, isn't he?" "Surely they won't dare attack a prepared town." "Ryder's not known for caution," Reed said, stepping closer. "May I?" He gestured toward her pistol. After a moment's hesitation, Grace handed it over, watching as he examined the weapon with practiced ease. "Good piece," he commented, returning it. "Now, if you're willing to take some advice purely professional, widen your stance a bit more, like this." He demonstrated, feet planted firmly shoulder-width apart. "Gives you better balance for the recoil." Grace mimicked his position, feeling oddly vulnerable as he studied her form with a critical eye. "Better," he said. "Now try again." She took aim at the remaining cans and fired. The shots came more smoothly, and she hit 5 out of 6. "Not bad," Reed said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. "My father taught me," she found herself explaining. "He believed women should know how to protect themselves." "Smart man." Reed set up more cans on the fence. "Where is he now, your father?" Grace's hands tightened on the gun. "He died 2 years ago." Reed seemed to hear the things she wasn't saying. He nodded without pressing further. "Let's try again. This time, draw from under your skirt. In a real situation, you won't have time to aim carefully." For the next half hour, Reed guided her through various shooting scenarios. offering advice in his gravelly voice that somehow managed to be authoritative without being condescending. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Grace was drawing and firing with a fluidity that surprised even herself. "You're a quick study, Miss Nichols," Reed remarked as they collected the battered cans. "Most people take much longer to improve their technique." "Most people didn't have Colonel William Nichols for a father," Grace replied, a small smile playing at her lips despite herself. "He was exacting in his expectations. A military man, that explains a few things." Reed handed her the last of the cans. "We should head back. People will talk if they see us out here alone." The reminder of propriety snapped Grace back to reality. What was she doing, practicing shooting with a strange man at dawn? If any of the town gossips saw them, her reputation would be in tatters. "Yes, of course," she said stiffly, quickly tucking her gun away. "Thank you for the instruction, Mr. Reed." He tipped his hat, that same almost smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "My pleasure, Miss Nichols." They walked back toward town in silence, maintaining a proper distance from each other. As they reached the edge of Kennewick, Reed spoke again. "Sheriff's calling a town meeting tonight, 7 o'clock at the church. You should be there." Grace nodded. "I will be." Reed hesitated, then added more quietly, "Ryder's dangerous, Miss Nichols. If he comes to Kennewick, there's going to be trouble. Real trouble." "Are you trying to frighten me, Mr. Reed?" "I'm trying to prepare you." His eyes, serious now, held hers. "The West isn't always kind to those who aren't ready for its harshness." With that cryptic warning, he touched the brim of his hat and strode off toward the sheriff's office, leaving Grace to wonder just what kind of man Wyatt Reed really was, and what sort of danger was riding toward Kennewick. The day's lessons were a challenge, with Grace struggling to keep her mind on spelling and arithmetic rather than the impending threat. The children sensed her distraction, becoming restless and inattentive as the hours wore on. "Miss Nichols, is it true there's a gunfighter staying at the school?" Tommy Parker finally asked during the afternoon recess, his freckled face alight with curiosity. Grace sighed. News traveled fast in small towns. "Mr. Reed is assisting Sheriff Miller with some official business, Tommy. That's all you need to know." "Pa says he's killed 20 men, piped up another boy, eyes wide. "Says he's the fastest gun west of the Mississippi." "That's enough," Grace said firmly. "Mr. Reed's business is his own, and I'll not have idle gossip in my classroom. Now, who can recite the Gettysburg Address?" The rest of the day passed in similar fashion, with Grace repeatedly redirecting the children's attention from speculation about Reed and the rumored bandits to their studies. By the time the final bell rang, her nerves were frayed and her patience thin. She hadn't seen Reed since their morning encounter, and the storeroom door remained closed as she tidied the classroom and prepared for the town meeting. Part of her hoped he wouldn't return until after she'd left for the church, unsure as she was about how to act around him. Their dawn shooting practice had created a strange intimacy between them, not romantic, exactly, but a shared secret that set him apart from the other residents of Kennewick. Grace was just pinning her hat in place when the front door opened and Reed entered, looking dustier and more grim than before. "Miss Nichols," he acknowledged with a nod. "Heading to the meeting?" "Yes," she replied, watching as he crossed to the water bucket and dipped the ladle for a long drink. "Have you learned anything more about the gang's movements?" Reed set the ladle down and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "They've moved closer. 15 miles out, by my reckoning. They've added a few more men, 2 locals with grudges or greed. How many are there now? 8, maybe 9. His eyes met hers. Too many for the sheriff and his deputy to handle alone. "And that's why you're here," Grace said. It wasn't a question. Reed's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "That's why I'm here." "What aren't you telling me, Mr. Reed?" Grace asked, suddenly certain there was more to this story than a bounty hunter tracking outlaws. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer honestly. Something flashed in his eyes, pain perhaps, or anger long banked but never extinguished. Then his expression shuddered, becoming unreadable. "We should go," he said instead. "Sheriff will be waiting." The church was already crowded when they arrived, the townsfolk packed into pews and standing along the walls. Grace nodded to Mrs. Patterson and the other boarding house residents as she made her way to a seat near the front, where the town's other respectable women had gathered. Reed remained at the back, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Sheriff Miller stood at the pulpit, looking uncomfortable in the reverend's usual place. Beside him, Deputy Collins fidgeted with his hat, his young face flushed with what might have been excitement or fear. "Folks," the sheriff began once the murmuring died down, "I've called you here because we've got trouble heading our way. Many of you have heard about the Ryder Gang. They've been moving through the territory, robbing stage coaches and small banks, leaving a trail of dead men behind them." A worried murmur rippled through the congregation. "We have reliable information that they're heading toward Kennewick, possibly arriving within the next 2 days. What do they want with our town?" called out Mr. Finch from the general store. "We're hardly worth robbing." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "Well, that's the thing. They may not be coming just to rob us. Jacob Ryder has personal business here." The sheriff's gaze flicked toward the back of the room where Reed stood. "I've asked for help from a man who knows Ryder better than most, Mr. Reed." All heads turned as Reed straightened and walked up the center aisle. Grace watched him move, noting the fluid grace that belied his size. He climbed the steps to stand beside the sheriff, facing the townspeople with the same impassive expression he'd worn when she first met him. "Some of you might have heard of me," Reed began, his deep voice carrying easily in the hushed church. "I've been tracking the Ryder Gang for almost a year now, from Missouri to here. What the sheriff didn't tell you is that Jacob Ryder and I have history." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "We rode together once, a long time ago, before he turned to murder and worse." Shocked whispers erupted around Grace. The woman beside her, the banker's wife, leaned away as if the very knowledge of Reed's past association with outlaws might taint her. Reed waited for the noise to subside before continuing. "I know how Ryder thinks, I know his tactics, and I know he's coming here because of me. He has a personal grudge that won't be settled until one of us is dead." "So you've brought this danger to our doorstep," shouted someone from the back. Reed's jaw tightened. Ryder was already heading this way. "The territorial governor wired me because he knew I was the best chance to stop him. I didn't expect to find him so close to Kennewick." "What do you suggest we do?" asked Reverend Porter, his usually gentle face troubled. "We're not soldiers or lawmen. Some of you have fought before," Reed replied, his gaze moving over the congregation. "I can see it. Indian wars, the rebellion down south. Others know how to handle a gun for hunting. We need every man who can shoot to help defend the town." "And what about our women and children?" demanded Mrs. Conroy, mother of Grace's oldest student. "Are we to sit by while our husbands and sons are shot down in the street?" Sheriff Miller stepped forward. "We've made arrangements. The mine office has a reinforced cellar. The women and children will shelter there if shooting starts." Grace found herself rising to her feet before she'd consciously decided to speak. "And what if the shooting comes to us there?" "What then, Sheriff?" All eyes turned to her, and Grace felt her cheeks warm. But she lifted her chin and continued. "If the Ryder Gang breaks through the men's defense, who will protect those in the cellar? Should we not be prepared to defend ourselves as well?" A shocked silence followed her words, broken finally by Reed's deep chuckle. "The schoolteacher has a point," he said. "Any woman who wants to learn how to handle a firearm should have the chance. Better to have a fighting chance than none at all." Several of the town matrons looked scandalized, but Grace noticed a few of the younger women nodding cautiously. Mrs. Patterson, practical as always, stood up as well. "I kept a shotgun behind the bar in my late husband's saloon for 15 years, she announced. "Saved my life twice. I'm with Miss Nichols on this." The meeting dissolved into heated discussion after that, with the town divided between those who welcomed Reed's assistance and those who viewed him with suspicion, those who supported arming the women and those who found the very idea unthinkable. Eventually, Sheriff Miller called for order. "Here's what we're going to do," he announced. "Mr. Reed and I will organize the men who can shoot. Deputy Collins will coordinate lookouts. Reverend Porter will oversee preparations at the mine office." And he added with a glance at Grace, "Miss Nichols has volunteered to instruct any women who wish to learn basic firearm use." Grace blinked in surprise. She had suggested no such thing, though she couldn't deny the logic of it. "We'll meet tomorrow at first light to begin preparations," the sheriff concluded. "Until then, I suggest you all go home, secure your valuables, and pray that the Ryder gang changes course." As the meeting broke up, Grace found herself surrounded by a small group of women, some curious, others determined. "Is it true you can shoot, Miss Nichols?" asked Emma Conroy's mother, her expression torn between disapproval and interest. "My father taught me," Grace replied simply. "In times like these, such skills may prove necessary." "I want to learn," said Jenny Fielding, the blacksmith's daughter, a strong-willed girl of 19. "Pa's always said I have a good eye." Several other women murmured agreement, while others looked doubtful but unwilling to be left defenseless. "Very well," Grace said, surprised by her own confidence. "Meet me behind the schoolhouse tomorrow at noon. Bring whatever firearms you have access to, but no ammunition. We'll start with the basics." As the women dispersed, Grace became aware of Reed watching her from nearby, an unreadable expression on his face. "That was brave," he said when she approached. "Not many would stand up like that, especially a woman with a position like yours to protect." "My position is already compromised by housing you in the schoolhouse, Mr. Reed," she replied with a touch of wryness. "I might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb." A genuine smile broke across his face, transforming it in a way that made Grace's breath catch. "I'm beginning to think there's more to you than meets the eye, Miss Nichols. I could say the same about you," she studied him carefully. "You were an outlaw once." It wasn't a question, but Reed nodded anyway. "A long time ago, I was young and angry at the world. Ryder and I rode with a gang out of Missouri. Small-time stuff at first-freight wagons, wealthy travelers. Then things changed." His expression darkened. "Ryder developed a taste for cruelty, started killing even when there was no need." "What happened?" Reed's eyes grew distant. "We hit a stagecoach outside of Springfield. Should have been simple, but there was a woman on board traveling alone. Ryder took an interest in her. I tried to stop him." His hand unconsciously moved to a scar on his forearm that Grace hadn't noticed before. "Nearly died for my trouble. Ryder left me for dead. But you survived," Grace said softly. "A farmer found me, patched me up. His wife was a former nurse from the war. While I was recovering, I had time to think about the path I was on." Reed's gaze returned to hers. "I walked away from that life. Took a job as a ranch hand in Colorado, then deputy in a small town. Eventually started tracking men like the one I used to be, and now you're tracking Ryder. He's left too many bodies behind him. Someone needs to stop him." Grace heard what he wasn't saying. "You're planning to kill him." "If I have to," Reed's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "Prefer to take him back to stand trial, but Ryder won't allow that. He'll die before he lets himself be caged." A chill ran down Grace's spine at the resolute certainty in his voice. This was a man who had made his peace with death, both dealing it and potentially receiving it. "Be careful tomorrow with those women," Reed said, changing the subject. "Teaching someone to shoot is one thing. Preparing them to shoot at another human being is something else entirely." "I'm well aware of the difference, Mr. Reed, but I'd rather they have the skills and never need them than be helpless if the worst happens." Reed nodded, that almost smile returning briefly. "Good night, Miss Nichols. Lock the schoolhouse when you return." As Grace watched him walk away toward the saloon, where the men were gathering to continue their discussion over whiskey, she couldn't help but wonder about the complex man who had unexpectedly entered her life. An outlaw turned lawman, a killer with a conscience. Dangerous, certainly, but perhaps not in the way she had initially feared. The next day dawned clear and cold, a deceptively peaceful morning that belied the tension gripping Kennewick. Grace rose early again, but did not go to her shooting spot, unwilling to leave the schoolhouse unattended with Reed's belongings inside. Instead, she prepared lesson plans, though she doubted many children would attend school with the threat of bandits looming. She was proven right when only 7 students appeared at the usual time. After consulting with their parents, Grace assigned reading and simple exercises, allowing the children to work at their own pace while she prepared for her noon meeting with the women. Reed had not returned to the schoolhouse the previous night, and Grace wondered if he'd found other accommodations or simply worked through the night. Her question was answered when he appeared shortly before noon, looking tired but alert. "Sheriff's posting men at the town entrances," he informed her, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Gave me a few minutes to check on things here." "Things are fine," Grace replied, gesturing to the handful of students bent over their slates, although attendance is understandably low. Reed nodded, glancing at the children with an expression that might have been wistfulness. "Might be best to send them home early, just in case." Grace understood his concern. "I was planning to at noon after their parents come for the lesson." "About that," Reed said, lowering his voice. "I've spoken to some of the women. You'll have quite a group." "I hope I can do them justice," Grace admitted. "I'm hardly an expert marksman. You know more than they do, that's what matters." Reed hesitated, then added, "I can stay if you'd like, offer some additional guidance." Grace considered the offer. Having Reed present would lend credibility to her instruction, but it might also undermine her authority with the women, many of whom were already skeptical about a female teacher. "Thank you, but I think it's best if I handle this alone," she decided. These women need to develop confidence in their own abilities, not rely on a man's presence. Reed seemed to understand her reasoning. "Fair enough, but if you need anything, I'll send for you," she promised. True to Reed's prediction, a substantial group gathered behind the schoolhouse after Grace had dismissed her students. 15 women ranging in age from Jenny Fielding at 19 to Mrs. Patterson at 62 stood in a nervous cluster, each holding some manner of firearm, mostly old revolvers and a few shotguns, with one ancient musket that looked like it dated to the Revolution. Grace surveyed them calmly, drawing on her experience commanding the attention of rowdy children. "Ladies, thank you for coming. Before we begin with the practical instruction, I want to establish some basic rules of safety." For the next hour, Grace patiently explained the fundamentals of firearm handling, demonstrating proper grip, stance, and aiming techniques. She corrected their form, praised their efforts, and gently but firmly insisted on strict adherence to safety protocols. Most of the women proved to be attentive students, particularly after Grace demonstrated her own skill by drawing her hidden Colt and hitting a tin can placed on a fence post 30 yards away. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" asked Jenny Fielding, eyes wide with admiration. "My father believed that education should be comprehensive," Grace replied. "He taught me that a woman's mind is her greatest asset, but in certain circumstances, other skills become necessary." "My husband would have a fit if he saw me here," confessed Mrs. Conroy, somewhat defiantly holding a small revolver that had belonged to her late father. "He says women have no business with guns." "And what does Mr. Conroy propose you do if bandits break into your home while he's at the mine?" asked Mrs. Patterson bluntly. "Expire daintily upon the fainting couch," the women laughed, tension breaking, and Grace seized the opportunity to move them to the next phase of instruction. "Tomorrow we'll practice with live ammunition," she announced. "Today was about fundamentals. Remember, a weapon is only as effective as the person wielding it. Confidence and calm are as important as accuracy." As the women dispersed, Grace noticed Reed watching from the corner of the schoolhouse. He approached when the others had gone, his expression thoughtful. "You're a natural teacher," he observed. "They respect you." "Teaching is about earning trust," Grace replied, suddenly tired as the adrenaline of the lesson faded, whether it's multiplication tables or firearms. Reed nodded toward the targets she'd set up. You didn't tell them, did you? About your morning practice sessions. Grace shook her head. It wasn't relevant. They needed to focus on their own progress, not compare themselves to me. Wise decision. Reed glanced toward town, where men could be seen constructing barricades at strategic points. Sheriff wants to see you. Something about organizing the children if things go badly. I'll go now. Grace hesitated, then asked, any word on the gang's movements? Reed's expression darkened. They're moving faster than expected. Scouts spotted them 10 miles out around dawn, could be here by nightfall if they push hard. Grace felt fear clutch at her heart, but she kept her voice steady. Then we'd better be ready. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Grace met with Sheriff Miller and helped organize a plan for the children's safety, assigned older students to watch over younger ones, and prepared emergency supplies for the mine office shelter. By the time dusk began to fall, Kennewick had transformed from a peaceful frontier town into an armed camp. Barricades of wagons, barrels, and sandbags blocked the main approaches to town. Men with rifles took up positions on rooftops and behind windows. The women and children, along with the elderly and infirm, were gathered at the mine office, ready to descend into the reinforced cellar at the first sign of trouble. Grace found herself standing on the schoolhouse porch as the last light faded, her Colt loaded and secured in its hidden holster. She had changed from her usual teaching attire into a simpler dress with fewer petticoats, allowing for easier movement if fighting broke out. You should be at the shelter, Reed said, appearing silently beside her. He had shed his leather vest in favor of a dark coat that better concealed his movements in the twilight. A second revolver had joined the one at his hip, and Grace suspected he carried additional weapons out of sight. I will be, she assured him. I wanted to secure the schoolhouse first. Reed studied her face in the gathering darkness. You're afraid. It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. Yes, but fear can sharpen the senses. My father always said, if you don't let it master you. Your father sounds like a wise man. Reed's voice had softened slightly. I wish I could have met him. The simple statement caught Grace off guard, implying as it did a world where their paths might have crossed under different circumstances, where Reed might have been a suitor calling at her father's home rather than a bounty hunter preparing for a gunfight. He would have liked you, I think, she found herself saying. Despite your colorful past, Reed's laugh was low and surprisingly warm. That's generous of you to say, Miss Nichols, but we both know a man like me would never have made it past your front door in Boston. Before Grace could respond, a shout rang out from the direction of the eastern barricade. Reed tensed, hand moving to his gun. That's the signal, he said, all warmth vanishing from his voice. They've been spotted on the ridge. Get to the shelter. Now. Grace hesitated, suddenly reluctant to leave. Mr. Reed, Wyatt, he interrupted, if I'm going to die tonight, I'd at least like to hear my Christian name from your lips once. Wyatt, she repeated softly, be careful. He nodded once, then turned and vanished into the darkness, moving toward the sound of approaching riders. Grace locked the schoolhouse and hurried toward the mine office, her heart pounding. Around her, Kennewick had gone eerily quiet, with only the occasional murmur of men at their posts breaking the silence. She had nearly reached the shelter when the first shots rang out, sharp cracks that echoed between the buildings. The battle for Kennewick had begun. Inside the mine office cellar, Grace found organized chaos. Mrs. Patterson had taken charge, assigning spaces to families and distributing blankets and water. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed with fear at the muffled sounds of gunfire from above. Miss Nichols. Tommy Parker called, breaking away from his mother to run to her. Are the bad men here? Grace knelt to his level, forcing a reassuring smile. Yes, Tommy, but Sheriff Miller and the other men will protect us. Remember what we practiced. Find your quiet place and stay with your group. The boy nodded solemnly and returned to his mother. Grace moved among the other children, offering comfort and distraction, all while straining to interpret the sounds of battle above. The gunfire had increased in intensity, suggesting the rider gang had pushed past the outer defenses. She found herself wondering where Reed Wyatt was positioned, whether he had already confronted his former partner, whether he was even still alive. The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest that surprised her with its intensity. An hour passed, then another. The gunfire ebbed and flowed, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close. Grace maintained her calm exterior for the sake of the children, but inside, her mind raced through increasingly dire scenarios. Then, abruptly, the cellar door flew open. Several women screamed before recognizing Deputy Collins, his young face streaked with sweat and what looked like blood. "They've broken through the west barricade," he panted. "Heading this way. Sheriff says to be ready to move out the back if they get too close." "How many are there?" Grace asked, moving forward. "Started with 9, Collins replied grimly. "We've got 3 of them, but they're still outnumbering us and riders with them." "What about Mr. Reed?" The question escaped before Grace could stop herself. Collins shook his head. "Don't know. Lost track of him when they flanked us at the general store." Fear clutched at Grace's heart, but she pushed it aside. "What do you need us to do, Deputy?" "Stay put for now. I've got to get back out there." He hesitated, then added, "If you hear 3 short whistles, it means they're too close. Use the back tunnel and head for the trees. There's a path marked that leads to the Henderson farm 3 miles west." With that grim instruction, Collins was gone, the cellar door secured behind him. Grace turned to find the women looking to her for leadership, their faces pale in the lantern light. She drew strength from their need, straightening her shoulders. "Ladies, you heard the deputy. We stay calm and prepared. Mrs. Patterson, organize the supplies in case we need to move quickly. Mrs. Conroy, check the back exit to ensure it's clear. The rest of you, keep the children calm and quiet." As the women moved to comply, Grace discreetly checked her hidden Colt, ensuring it was loaded and ready. She prayed she wouldn't need to use it, but the grim reality was that Kennewick's defenses were failing. If the rider gang reached the mine office, the women's shooting lesson might prove more immediately necessary than any of them had anticipated. Another hour crawled by. The sounds of gunfire had grown sporadic but closer, suggesting the fighting had moved into the town center. Grace had just begun to hope that the defenders had rallied when a new sound reached them: heavy footsteps on the floorboards directly above. Every woman in the cellar froze, eyes turned upward. Grace slowly drew her Colt, gesturing for the others to gather the children at the back of the room near the escape tunnel. Mrs. Patterson and Jenny Fielding, who had shown the most aptitude during the shooting lesson, quietly retrieved their own weapons. The footsteps moved across the office floor, paused, then approached the cellar door. Grace raised her gun, aiming at the entrance, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her. The door creaked open a few inches, and a voice called down, "Miss Nichols, it's Reed." Relief flooded through Grace, nearly making her dizzy. "Mr. Reed," she called back, lowering her weapon slightly but not entirely. "Are you alone?" "Yes, it's safe to come up, but we need to move quickly. Ryder's men have split up, and 3 of them are heading this way." Grace glanced at the frightened but resolute faces around her. "We're coming up." She led the group up the narrow stairs, emerging into the mine office to find Reed looking battered but very much alive. A cut above his eyebrow had bled down the side of his face, and he held his left arm at an awkward angle that suggested injury, but his eyes were clear and alert. "Sheriff's men have engaged the main group near the church," he explained rapidly as the women and children filed out of the cellar. But Ryder and 2 others broke off, heading east. "They're looking for something, or someone," Grace said, understanding dawning. "They're looking for you," Reed nodded grimly. "And they'll check every building in town until they find me. I need to draw them away from here before they discover the shelter." "What's your plan?" Grace asked, already suspecting she wouldn't like the answer. "I'm going to let them spot me, then lead them out of town toward the ridge." There's an old mining cabin up there, good defensive position, away from civilians. That's suicide, Grace protested. 3 against 1, Reed's mouth quirked in that almost smile. I've faced worse odds. Mr. Reed, Mrs. Patterson interrupted, her practical nature asserting itself. Where do you suggest we take the children? The original escape plan assumed the danger would come from the east, but if Ryder's men are already in that direction. Reed considered for a moment. The livery stable, it's clear and Fletcher's barricaded it well. Back entrance leads straight to the creek bed. If things go bad, follow it west out of town. As the women organized the children for movement, Reed drew Grace aside. I need a favor, he said quietly. Anything, she replied without hesitation, surprising herself with the depth of her commitment. Reed's eyes softened momentarily before his expression returned to its professional mask. If I don't come back, there's a letter in my saddlebag at the schoolhouse. See that it gets to Marshal Wilkins in Helena. Has information about Ryder's operation that might help them round up the rest of his men. You're coming back, Grace said firmly, refusing to contemplate the alternative. Reed didn't argue, but his grim expression spoke volumes. One more thing, he added. Whatever happens, don't follow me. Get those children to safety and stay with them. Before Grace could respond, Reed turned to address the group. Ready, we move fast and quiet, stay close to the buildings and away from open streets. With Reed leading and Grace bringing up the rear, the group slipped out of the mine office into the dark streets of Kennewick. The sounds of gunfire had diminished to occasional shots from the direction of the church, suggesting the main battle had either concluded or moved elsewhere. They had covered half the distance to the livery when a shout rang out from behind them. Reed, I see you, you treacherous son of a bitch. Grace turned to see 3 men emerging from an alley 30 yards back, their guns already drawn. The one in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard and a distinctive scar running from his left eye to his jaw. Jacob Ryder, she presumed. Keep moving, Reed ordered the group, pushing Mrs. Patterson forward. Get them to the livery, he told Grace. Now. Before she could protest, Reed stepped into the street, drawing both his revolvers in a smooth motion. Hello, Jacob, he called, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. Still hiding behind your men, I see. Ryder's laugh was harsh and ugly. Didn't expect to find you playing nursemaid in some backwater town, Wyatt. Lost your nerve after Springfield. Found my conscience, Reed replied. Something you wouldn't understand. While they exchanged words, Grace hurriedly shepherded the children and women toward the livery stable, which was now visible at the end of the street. She glanced back to see Reed backing away from Ryder and his men, drawing them in the opposite direction, toward the eastern edge of town. It was working. Ryder was following Reed, his attention fully captured by his former partner. But as Grace watched, one of Ryder's men broke off, heading toward the group of fleeing women and children. Inside, quickly, Grace ordered, pushing the last stragglers through the livery door. She drew her Colt, positioning herself between the advancing outlaw and the stable entrance. The man, thin and wiry with a pockmarked face, slowed when he saw her standing there with a gun. His expression shifted from surprise to amusement. Well now, what have we here? A schoolmarm playing soldier, he sneered, continuing his approach. Put that gun down before you hurt yourself, little lady. Grace held her ground, remembering everything her father had taught her, everything Reed had shown her. She widened her stance slightly, both hands steady on the weapon. Stay back, she warned, her voice clear and firm despite her pounding heart. The outlaw laughed. Or what? You'll shoot me. I've killed a dozen men tougher than you, sweetheart. Now move aside before I decide to take that pretty dress off you instead of just walking past. He was 10 yards away now, his own gun held casually at his side as if he didn't consider her a real threat. Grace took a deep breath, centering herself. Last warning, she said. The outlaw's grin widened as he took another step. You don't have the nerve. The crack of Grace's Colt interrupted him, the bullet striking his right shoulder and spinning him halfway around. He cursed violently, dropping his gun as he clutched at the wound. "You shot me," he gasped, genuine shock in his voice. "You actually shot me." "And I'll shoot again if you move," Grace replied, her voice steadier than she would have believed possible. "On the ground, hands behind your back." To her surprise, the outlaw complied, sinking to his knees and then face down in the dirt. Jenny Fielding appeared at Grace's side with a length of rope, and together they bound the man's hands securely. "Miss Nichols," Jenny whispered, her eyes wide, "you were amazing." Grace had no time to respond as more gunfire erupted from the direction Reed and Ryder had gone, a rapid exchange of shots followed by an ominous silence. "Get inside and bar the door," Grace ordered. "I'll be back." Ignoring Reed's instruction to stay with the children, Grace moved cautiously through the darkened streets toward the sound of the shooting. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her movements were deliberate, keeping to the shadows as Reed had done. She reached the eastern edge of town and paused, listening intently. A faint noise drew her attention to a narrow passage between the assayer's office and a storage shed. Moving closer, she saw a figure slumped against the wall. "Wyatt," she called softly, raising her gun. A groan answered her, and she rushed forward to find Reed sitting on the ground, his right hand pressed to his left side where a dark stain was spreading across his shirt. "Told you not to follow me," he muttered, grimacing as he tried to shift position. "When have I ever given you the impression that I'm good at following orders?" Grace replied, kneeling beside him and gently moving his hand to examine the wound. A bullet had grazed his side, painful and bleeding freely, but not immediately life-threatening. "Ryder?" she asked, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound. "Dead," Reed answered, his voice flat. "So's one of his men, the other ran off toward the hills." He paused, studying her face in the dim light. "You're unharmed, I'm fine," she assured him. "The women and children are safe at the livery. We encountered one of Ryder's men. He's tied up and wounded but alive." Reed's eyebrows rose. "You shot him in the shoulder," Grace confirmed, helping Reed to his feet. He seemed rather surprised about it. To her astonishment, Reed laughed, a genuine, warm sound despite his pain. "I can imagine. Most men would be underestimating you like that." His expression grew serious again as he leaned on her, allowing her to support some of his weight. "That was still a damn foolish thing to do, coming after me." "Perhaps," Grace acknowledged, "but I couldn't very well let you die out here alone after all the trouble you've caused." Reed's lips twitched. "Is that what I've done, caused trouble?" "Immeasurable amounts," Grace assured him as they made their slow way back toward the center of town, where figures could be seen moving with lanterns, suggesting the battle was truly over. "My reputation is likely beyond salvaging at this point, because you shot a man. Because I've been seen in the company of a known bounty hunter with a questionable past," she corrected primly, though there was no real censure in her voice. "Not to mention harboring said individual in my schoolhouse." Reed's expression sobered. "I'm sorry for that. I never meant to bring danger to you or the town." "I know," Grace said softly, "and in truth, I'm not sure my reputation was ever what it appeared to be. Boston schoolteachers don't typically practice their marksmanship at dawn." They had reached the main street now, where Sheriff Miller and a group of townsmen were gathered. A cheer went up when they spotted Reed, turning to concern when they noticed his injury and Grace's blood-stained dress. "Ryder?" the sheriff asked simply. "Won't be troubling anyone again," Reed confirmed. "One of his men escaped into the hills, heading north. The other," he glanced at Grace with something like pride, "is secured at the livery stable with a bullet in his shoulder," Grace finished. "He may require medical attention before you lock him up, Sheriff." The stunned expressions on the men's faces might have been comical under different circumstances. Sheriff Miller recovered first, dispatching men to retrieve the prisoner and check on the women and children. "Town doctors at the church tending the wounded," he told Reed. "Better get that side looked at." Reed nodded but made no move to release his hold on Grace. "In a minute, Miss Nichols and I have a matter to discuss first." The sheriff raised his eyebrows but withdrew tactfully, leaving them alone in a pool of lantern light surrounded by the darkness. "What matter would that be, Mr. Reed?" Grace asked, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of his arms still around her waist, ostensibly for support. "I find myself at a crossroads," he said, his voice low and serious. "Marshal Wilkins will expect a report. There's a bounty to collect on Ryder and his men. The logical thing would be to head to Helena in the morning." "Yes, that would be logical," Grace agreed, feeling a strange hollowness at the thought of his departure. "I imagine you're often in demand for your specialized skills." Reed studied her face intently. "The thing is, Miss Nichols, Grace, I'm finding the prospect of leaving Kennewick unexpectedly difficult." Grace's heart skipped a beat. "Are you, indeed?" Reed's storm gray eyes held hers. "And I can't help but wonder if it might be possible for a man with my history to find a place in a town like this. A fresh start, perhaps." "I believe second chances are the foundation of frontier life, Mr. Reed," Grace replied carefully, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning correctly. "Many who come west do so seeking new beginnings." "And would this theoretical new beginning extend to the possibility of courting a certain schoolteacher?" Reed asked, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips, despite the pain he must still be feeling from his wound. "A schoolteacher who, it should be noted, carries a gun under her skirts and shoots better than most men I've known." Grace felt warmth rush to her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "I believe that could be arranged, provided said schoolteacher's reputation survives the night's events." "I'd expect nothing less," Reed murmured, his smile widening into something genuine and warm that transformed his face from merely handsome to breathtaking. Later, Grace would reflect that it wasn't the most conventional beginning to a courtship standing in the middle of a street recently the site of a gunfight, her dress torn and bloodied, his side bandaged after a bullet wound. But as Wyatt Reed gently tilted her chin up and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that promised both passion and tenderness, she decided that conventional beginnings were highly overrated. The town of Kennewick, Montana would talk about that night for decades to come, the night they defeated the notorious Ryder gang, the night their schoolteacher revealed an unexpected talent with firearms, the night a bounty hunter with a shadowed past decided to hang up his guns and build a life in their community. And if the townspeople noticed how quickly Miss Grace Nichols became Mrs. Grace Reed just 3 months later in a small ceremony at the newly repaired church, they were wise enough not to question it too openly. After all, life on the frontier was unpredictable, and finding love amid danger was a tale as old as the West itself. The former schoolhouse became their home, expanded over time to accommodate first their private quarters, then a nursery for their son William, born exactly 1 year after the night of the Ryder gang attack, and later for their daughter Catherine. Wyatt took over as sheriff when Miller retired, bringing his extensive knowledge of the law's darker side to bear in keeping Kennewick safe as it grew from frontier outpost to thriving town. Grace continued teaching for several years, eventually founding a proper school with multiple classrooms and teachers. But she never gave up her dawn shooting practice, often joined by her husband, and when they were old enough, their children. "Some skills," she would tell her daughter while adjusting her stance just as Wyatt had once adjusted Grace's, "are worth maintaining, regardless of whether society believes they're proper for a lady." And if the good people of Kennewick sometimes glimpsed their respected sheriff's wife with the distinctive bulge of a Colt revolver beneath her skirts as she made her way to town meetings or school functions, they merely nodded in acknowledgement. After all, she had earned the right to her precautions, and as her husband often remarked with that particular smile reserved only for her, he'd expect nothing less from the remarkable woman who had captured his heart that fateful night when the Ryder gang came to Kennewick.